Righty, and welcome. Thank you very much for coming along to have a listen to this little presentation about insights in risk management. Great to see so many of you here. I know, terrible old joke, I can't see any of you, of course, but as a risk manager, I need to be optimistic that there's somebody out there getting some benefit from this. So I got a little bit carried away when I was preparing this presentation, and the original concept was 5 insights in risk management, but I ran a little over budget. I hope you won't mind. But look, on the bright side, I think maybe some of these you'll already know, but some will be brand new to you. And I guess you could say in about 25 plus years of risk management, maybe that's 1 or 2 epiphanies a year. Some of these are well researched, and some of these are just my own brain explosion. Others are ideas that have been shared with me by colleagues and friends. But I'll do my best to quickly run through them with you. And I am very much evidence-based kind of guy. And I'm the guy who goes and reads the original research or looks up at least the underlying documents, the peer-reviewed stuff behind it. So I wanted to actually, rather than just blather on for an hour, 45 minutes, whatever I can get away with here. I mean, each of these ideas I could talk for 45 minutes on quite easily, but I just want to give you a little taste of what some of the things that I've found really useful and productive. So, you know, when you're thinking about risk, when you're communicating with staff or communicating with clients, somewhere here you'll probably find a few insights that are useful. And I think you'll agree that risk management is becoming more important in this world rather than less important. You know, we don't need a pandemic to tell us that we're in a volatile environment. We know this, and let's see if we can get through. Now, the graphic on the screen, by the way, is a shot of the website where I've put all the links. It's an FYI.to curated website, so a little micro website. And I've tried to provide either presentations or books or something that's reasonably approachable, a case study for each of these ideas to let you explore them in more detail if you like. And, you know, of course, feel free to drop me a line if I mention a template or something like that, which isn't on the website. I'm happy to share whatever you're looking for. And please just let me know you're there. Ask a few questions in the text as we go along, and I'll do my best to answer them at the end. So the first insight I think most of us have already had in risk management, if we've been doing it for any length of time, is that it's never what you expect. Risk, we go into a scenario with one idea in mind, and quite often it's not. And you know, one example is the world of high reliability organizations, which is a well-studied area looking at things like nuclear aircraft carriers, nuclear power plants, air traffic control systems, highly complex and dangerous systems, inherently dangerous with constant activity and things that could go wrong. And yet they're often one of the safest places to work. They're one of the lowest risk environments. I mean, nuclear power plants, for example, have this innate capability to go horribly wrong, and yet perhaps because of that, they actually have one of the safest track records for energy production on the planet. And nuclear aircraft carriers as well, you know, aircraft loaded with explosives landing day and night on stormy seas on top of a floating nuclear reactor. I mean, what could possibly go wrong, right? So there's a lot of good work being done in this area about why these things work, and a lot of it comes down to culture. One of the insights I would say to share with you is that you manage risk at the point at which it occurs. And a simple example is if you look at an aircraft coming into land on an aircraft carrier, I mean, the pilot is in charge of the aircraft, the captain is in charge of the ship, the admiral is in charge of the fleet, but the lowest rating, who might have only joined that ship a week ago, might see a nut or a bolt or some sort of loose debris on the runway, which could get caught up in the aircraft intake and cause an accident. That individual is empowered and encouraged to call an abort on that landing or that takeoff if they see that there's something wrong there. You know, there's no question. If somebody down there at the point at which the risk is occurring calls a halt or wants to change the tune, they have the power to make that decision right there and then. I think that's a really key part of this. Another key part of this is not it's not what you think it is. You know, when I worked for the Department of Health and Aging, I was a senior risk advisor, and one of my roles was to look at all of the projects that were going on, and particularly in one instance, the IT projects. And a large project, 20 million plus project, which being government inevitably ended up costing more than that. Well, I can't just blame government, but it's the way of large projects, that this was getting a lot of attention, and rightly so for the complexity. But when I looked at it as an enterprise risk point of view, the highest risk project that was going on was a little project for the new website, a $100,000 project, which actually had more potential benefit or risk or harm than the larger projects that were going on, simply because people in the Australian public relied on our website to be able to make decisions about their future, about their health, and they would make decisions maybe for investments which would have lasting consequences. So not only do we have to be accurate, not only do we have to be consistent and timely, but we had to be able to provide evidence in terms of archiving that on the 1st of June in 2008, our website said X, not Y. And so all these little moving parts meant that this tiny project was actually the highest risk out of all the IT project portfolio. Not an outcome you would have expected, but something that was interesting to look at. And I think you all agree, they see this a lot. So let me get to the elephant in the room around risk. And one of the challenges that I find personally is that I love ISO 31000 for its elegance, and I really like the definition of risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. It's not perfect by any means, but I love that it includes a broad church, if you like, of how risk is approached, and it includes positive and negative consequences, which for me, and maybe for many of you, risk is positive and negative. But the problem is that outside 31,000, the rest of the world is going, risk is bad, risk is negative, risk is all adverse. Pick up any dictionary and look for risk, and you'll find it's all about adverse outcomes. So I think maybe we need to think about how we define it in a new lexicon, maybe even something that's looking at uncertainty management, or even going back to, if you think about the medical profession, their definitions are frozen in time, they're static. I mean, risk has gone from being a hazard at sea to evolve to modern terminology being something bad happening, or ISO 31000, something happening that affects objectives. But perhaps we need to think the medical approach and say, they use words like tension pneumothorax, which only means one thing, in a medical term, basically you've got a punctured ribs and you've got air on the wrong side of your lung. But to a medical professional or an ambulance officer or anybody working in that space, it's immediately obvious what it is. Words like proximal, distal, tibia, fibia, all this sort of radius and ulnar, the idea of anterior, posterior, there's no ambiguity, and they're not used outside the medical profession. So maybe we need to be thinking about a word for risk that does that. And one word, apart from uncertainty, if we wanted to co-opt an existing English language word, is maybe future management. And a good friend and colleague, Jason Brown, recently pointed out to me, he said that your risk management equals future management. We're trying to shape the future. We're trying to create the future. And Peter Bernstein, in his excellent book, Against the Gods, kind of highlighted this idea of the evolution of risk for human beings, we're at the fate of the gods. Our fate depended on the gods. Maybe we worshipped a mountain, or maybe we worshipped a pantheon of Greek gods. At different times in history, we had the idea that our fate was not our own. And maybe if we sacrificed a chicken, then the crops would grow better. But eventually we started evolving this kind of idea around not just being at the mercy of the gods, but being able to influence the future, looking at science and technology, and looking at risk management as a way to think about probability and consequence, and looking at what we do and having influence. So this is the insight for me with risk management. It's about future management. And what's even more interesting is if you think about that transition from okay, our fate is at the hand of the gods. We took the audacious and dangerous approach perhaps of tempting the gods by saying, no, you know what, we're going to go against the gods, and we're going to manage our own fate. And what's next in this process? Where are we going with technology? Where are we going with our ability to shape the future? And without getting too much into quantum physics, this is a whole can of worms that we know so little about our known universe. I won't even go too deeply into that, but the potential for where we go with this discipline of risk management now is unlimited, and we need to be thinking about that. So yeah, risk management equals future management. But if in the future we can see what's coming out of or what we'd like to see as a destination, we see our objectives in the front window, we see what's happened in the rearview mirror, but we have our blind spots. And part of my success in life and self-awareness has been this journey of constantly looking for my blind spots. Now, my friends who know me well will see things about me that I don't see, and vice versa. I see things about them that seem obvious to me, but invisible to them. And when we're doing risk management, it's the same. As part of a good risk study, you'll be interviewing executives and frontline managers and all sorts of people to find out what's going on in the organization. Throw that question in there. Just ask them, what are the blind spots? What's the boss not seeing? What are our competitors not seeing that we do? What are we not seeing that our competitors are doing? Because these are the things where the risks come from. These are the things about truly anticipating the future, is not being a victim of our own heuristics and blind spots, but allowing our organization to document that. And really a thorough SWOT analysis and a whole range of analytical tools can help us do this. So some great stuff, a couple of references on blind spots for you. And please, if you're out there and you see some blind spots for me, please let me know. I'm always grateful for anything on that. But in terms of blind spots, let's think about one of the blind spots we think about are what we call black swan events. So, this is Nassim Taleb's concept of events which come out of nowhere, are unanticipated, perhaps couldn't be calculated by probability calculations, but have a large effect on history. My view is it's 2020. We've had catastrophic bushfires, over 800 bushfires burning in Australia in January. We've had catastrophic bushfires in California. We've had locust plagues in East and Central Africa. We've had pestilence. We've had plague. We've got COVID-19. We're facing what's maybe the biggest depression or the worst depression in recorded history, if things go as they're looking like they're going to be going. I don't think we can afford to say anymore, oh, that was a black swan. Oh, sorry, boss, black swan came out of nowhere. It's our job as risk managers to make the black swans visible. I mean, even the idea of black swans was calculable. When the concept originally is that Europeans only had white swans and all swans were therefore white, until they came to Western Australia in the 18th century and discovered that some swans were black. But you know what? I think swans are black, white, red, green, blue. Because we haven't seen them, doesn't mean we can't anticipate that there's going to be a bird out there of a different colour. And this is our job as risk managers. So RIP the black swan. Swans come in all colours, and we either need to be predicting them, we're using our imagination to see them. We need to be, put that black swan in the oven and bake it, or set it free and with its home with all the other red and green swans. But let's start anticipating the future, not just, it's lazy risk management to say, sorry, that was a black swan, didn't see it coming, boss, better luck next time. And the public, the world deserves better. So what do we do? What are some of the thinking tools we can use? Well, there's this idea of risk matrix as a thinking tool, and this is a really simple matrix. The Stroud matrix is just a 2x2, consequence across the bottom, likelihood on the side, and the idea that it has two uses for me at my mind. Firstly, as a conceptual discussion framework when we're looking at doing risk studies and we're looking at scoping and we're looking at where do we put our immediate resources, and we look at how we might consider risks in terms of identifying them. And we have at an enterprise level a low likelihood, low consequence risk might be somebody's computer fails, a hard drive fails on a desktop computer. Okay, it doesn't happen very often, and when it does, it actually doesn't really matter a lot. By contrast, if we have a server failure or a data center fails, that goes from being business as usual to being a swan, black swan, white swan, green swan, whatever you want to call it. These are the big things which, again, won't happen very often, but will be catastrophic if they do. And we really need to be thinking about having hot sites, backups, redundancies, all this sort of thing. And we do, for the most part. This is a concept of the difference between, if you like, a desktop computer and a server, or any other category of risks, financial or whatever, whether it's petty theft or fraud or ransomware. And then there's the routine risks, which we know happen a lot, but aren't that big a deal. A large organization will regularly have car crashes or slips, trips and falls, or maybe there'll be, projects that fail. This is pretty much routine stuff which we manage as part of normal business. But the real focus is this idea of the danger zone, high consequence, high likelihood. So things like maybe ransomware or cyber attacks, where we know they're almost certain. We know our servers are being hit constantly, daily, by attempts or at least probes looking for weaknesses to get in. And we know that organizations are constantly facing multi-million-dollar ransomware attacks and cyber attacks, which have incredible brand damage. So this is sort of part of the thinking tool using the Stroud matrix to evolve that. But another use for Stroud Matrix is in terms of crisis management. And I mentioned that Australia had 800 bushfires burning in January. I mean, crazy. Some of the biggest, possibly the biggest bushfires, or the second biggest at least in Australian recorded history. And if you think about the incident commanders in each state and how they're having to make decisions to allocate resources, they've only got a finite number of fire crews and helicopters and aircraft, and they have to look at these things and say, okay, I've got 20 fires that have just started which I need to address, and how do I prioritise where I put my crews? So when you think about this, think, okay, we've got a fire over here which is, it's in an area where it's quite damp and the fire load's not very strong, so it's not likely to take off, and if it does, it's going to go into grassland, whereas versus these 4 or 5 fires over here on a different area of our state where maybe they are burning in forest that's very dry with a high fuel load, a high wind area, and they're moving towards a populated area. So you can see immediately, one of these is a low likelihood, low consequence kind of idea of a fire, and another one is immediately in the danger zone where we're thinking, this is where I need to put my resources. And it's the same in a corporate crisis management. If you have some sort of a corporate crisis, you need to be making decisions quickly and effectively in allocating resources, and there needs to be some discussion and agreement around these ideas, not just the gut feel of, this feels really bad, or this is getting more the media at the moment, but a quick and effective way of making those decisions. And so that's the Stroud Matrix, which, by the way, is called the Stroud Matrix because I sort of created it out of thin air when I happened to be living in the village of Stroud in England. And that was recently we were there, and it's a lovely place to visit, so that's a bit of free publicity for Stroud and the farmers markets there. But I hope it's useful, and that's just one of these ways we all use this mental model of risk, but we don't often have something like this to share with people and put it up on a whiteboard and sketch it out and go, is this a danger zone? Is it a swan? Is this just BAU for business as usual? So that's one way to use a risk matrix. There are other ways, and I know it's pretty, there's a lot of people are very down on risk matrices at the moment and saying, we shouldn't be using them, they produce worse results than ever. There are a couple of things about the problems we have with risk matrices which can be addressed, I think, to make them useful tools. And the first one is that most of the studies which look at risk matrices actually didn't define the risk fully. So I've got a model I use which is called CASE, which is short for Consequence, Asset, Source, Event, which is a way of describing a risk. So rather than describing an information breach, we're describing loss of information due to a cyber attack by state-sponsored actors, resulting in a loss of corporate client data, whatever it might be. So that's a much more easy and definable risk. Otherwise, you're trying to get 10 people in a room and saying data loss, and everybody's got a different idea of data loss. For one, it's the basement getting flooded. Another one, it's the servers being corrupted. Someone else. So defining those risks well will give you a much clearer attitude, understanding about the likelihood of this risk eventuating. And in this little 10 by 10 example of a matrix and this is not strictly speaking an analysis tool, this is a way of presenting the risks. Okay, so this is a way of communicating the risk. In this one, I've plotted 0 to 1 or 100, percentage, so probability in the mathematical sense on the likelihood there on the y-axis, and I've plotted consequence again as a 0 to 1, 0 to 100% on the x-axis, talking about consequence. And in this model, this hypothetical corporation has said that our net worth, if we lose our net worth, we're bankrupt. So maybe you're worth $10 million. If we have an event which goes over $10 million, pardon me. Okay, so if we have an event, back again, which costs us more than the net worth of the company, we will be unable to pay it. Now that this is, should include in that contingent capital like insurance policies, okay? But this is a simple example of the company facing what they determine as being a catastrophic risk. Now, when we have a risk, and risk A in this example has been evaluated as having a 60% chance of happening, and it's been analysed using, let's say Monte Carlo to produce a probability distribution, and it's been determined that the most likely outcome is that 70% of the company's net worth will be gone if this risk eventuates. But it could only maybe be 40% of the net worth, or it could be 100% of the net worth, in which case there's a very low likelihood on this more or less normal distribution, but a very low likelihood on that far right there that it is a catastrophic risk event. So here we've got because it's very tempting to criticize risk matrices because people use them as a point and shoot tool and go, across here it's this likely, it's going to have that consequence. Even a slips, trips and falls. It could be a sprain or a bruise or nothing, or it could be even a fatality if someone cracks their head. So none of these risks have like a point and shoot risk rating because it's going to have a definite consequence. Yes, it's more likely to be one thing or the other, but that's not really how risks work out in the real world. So now, you'll notice on risk C there at the bottom, it's got a double hump, and that's because some risks, like a major project, for example, might say, well, it's most likely going to cost us this much for the project, or if the building burns down, it's going to cost this much. But there is a very small risk which increases as the severity of the fire increases. For example, that if the fire does get out of control and we get close to a total loss of our facility, it's actually going to go into the neighbouring facility and burn down a neighbour, and we'll have a liability case, which gives us a far higher cost. So there's, the probability distributions aren't necessarily just nice and simple normal distributions. I mean, the risk B is a nice left skew, risk A is a normal, but so you need to think about how these affect. And again, one of the key takeaways here on this matrix is that we look first at the likelihood in terms of probability of something happening, and then we look at consequence, not just on a notional, it's minor or it's bad or it's somewhere in the middle, but we start putting some sort of quantitative value around. Is this existential or not? And bear in mind, if one of these curves is actually heading over, risk A, might have a long tail well to the right of that extreme end of the consequence scale, but it's a bit of a moot point how far it goes to the right, because if we know this is a risk which has a certain point, and you may actually want to plot it certainly to show the tail if there's a large amount there, but really once we start getting to that, we need to have an idea that, yeah, this could well be existential or catastrophic for us in our definition. So that's kind of one way of looking at risk. Now there's a couple of ways of looking at, so how does this risk occur and how do we manage it if we have these notional risks? One of the more interesting aspects for me these days is causal chains, and Swiss cheese is a model which sort of illustrates that idea with barriers being modeled as slices of cheese, and if all the holes line up, then you get this scenario where risk manifests. But more interestingly, I think you need to think, and any major fatality that I've investigated or studied, or any major risk outcome, it's not been that one or two things went wrong. A whole series of things had to go wrong, any one of which, if it had been cut, if that link had been broken in that chain, would have reduced the magnitude. I mean, Piper Alpha started with, and Piper Alpha was an oil rig, by the way, in 1988 in the North Sea. A series of failures caused first a major oil fire and then a catastrophic gas explosion. And this took a dozen things had to go wrong before this manifested as a major risk. I mean, not a major risk, it was a tragic fatality for 167 men and their families and their friends. But when you look at this, and I've included a link in the references here to a presentation by Brian Appleton, who was on the Lord Cullen Royal Inquiry, and it's the most elegant and eloquent presentation I've seen of causal chain. I'd really encourage you to spend the time to have a look at it. It's only 40 minutes, fabulous little presentation which lays out how all these things had to go wrong. And in a positive risk too, it's like project manager, all the things have to go right. All the links in the chain have to be strong before this happens. And there's no risk which doesn't have positive and negative benefits. There's no treatment you can put in place which doesn't introduce risks. So putting this to a causal chain model, and Nancy Leveson did some great stuff with engineering in terms of causality and modelling that. But start maybe with this Piper Alpha presentation by Brian Appleton, because this is, with bow ties and a whole range of other things, this is a great way of looking at risks. And even if you use this concept to model near-miss events, a really thorough analysis of a near-miss is probably going to prevent a major fatality. So what do we do? That's a way of looking at risks at each risk sort of level. But when we talk about enterprise risk management, it can be very difficult for people to understand. They often have this idea that risk management at an enterprise level is about documenting all the risks, putting in place a piece of software, hunting out the risks, sending people out around the world to look at your facilities and all the exposures, and that's more or less playing whack-a-mole, really. That's not, you're going to be death by 1,000 cuts trying to treat enterprise risk by that way. What you need to do is aggregate the risks in a way that you can say, okay, here's my risk criteria, my risk appetite, my tolerance, and I want wherever my facilities are or my people are operating or whatever my projects are, I want them to have more or less the same risk. So in a physical sense, if you have someone at a head office in New York and you've got a branch office in Kabul, they should be facing, you shouldn't expect people in Kabul to be dodging bullets every day. Just as London versus Bogota, you should be able to put in place things which level the playing field. So for me, enterprise risk management is about topography and about understanding the helicopter view of looking down. So the rock pool is the metaphor that I use, or the analogy. And the idea is that if your enterprise is a rock pool, there are high points where you can stand on a rock and you'll be out of the water. There are points where you're facing, you're walking through the sandy base and there's a level of risk that's up to your shins and you're happy with that. And, well, maybe you're not happy with that, but let's just assume that shin deep is your level of risk. The concept then is that as you're walking through the rock pool, there are going to be holes, there are going to be bits of coral, hidden holes where you could turn an ankle or injure yourself severely. And the idea is not to bring a truckload of sand to fill this rock pool up so that you're not walking through any water and that you've even leveled all the holes, because that's a wasteful use of resources. And then the first tide of history, the tide of change comes through, the environment changes, the technology changes, the threat profile changes, your competitors become more sophisticated. The tides will wash all that sand out and they'll leave you with a new set of highs and lows and hollows. So what you're trying to do in this analogy is just look at the high and the low points and understand that topography and say, okay, well, here's a couple of rocks where I'm over-treating it. This is the high ground, but it's way higher than the rest of, it's way safer than the rest of my financial portfolio, for example. So I might move some of that money or some of those resources, some of those people, by metaphorically rolling one of those rocks into a hole to level out the hole. And maybe you bring a bag of sand along and a little bucket of sand, and you fill around the edge of that rock and you level out this field. So that's enterprise risk management for me. It's trying to create a level topography. And as the tide comes up or down, you might think, well, I need more sand or less sand, but you have a set of criteria, a set of standards, if you like, for how we address risk in different areas. And that, anyway, so risk management frameworks and the rock pool metaphor. Now, speaking of this idea of how do we level things out and how do we understand the tides of change that are coming, well, we don't necessarily need to. COVID-19 is, as tragic as it is in terms of the deaths and the economic impact and the illness that it's causing and stress for people, and it's not a good thing, but it's, if you like, preparing us for what we know is inevitably going to be a worse pandemic, a higher risk, worse disease load. And so in a sense, it's educating the public, the politicians, the medicos. We're running trials to develop vaccines faster than ever. People are now understanding how masks work and how to communicate this risk. We're understanding social distancing or physical distancing. We're using Zoom and all these other technologies to better effect. And that, if you like, is a preparation for the future. And I'll give you another example from my own experience. When East Timor was becoming independent from Indonesia, the Australian government offered a lot of help to East Timor to get them set up and to be able to achieve that independence with social stability and a whole range of other governance, as well as some military support. And some Indonesians took umbrage to this because they didn't think it was right that East Timor should be independent or whatever it was. For whatever reason, they started doing drive-by shootings of the Australian embassy in Jakarta. So the Australian embassy responded by putting in bulletproof glass, or ballistic glass as it's called technically. And that was very effective. And then fast forward another 5 years later, after 9/11, Jemaah Islamiyah are looking for a target to attack to make a point in Jakarta, and they loaded a van up with explosives. They drive past the American embassy, it's too hard. They drive past the Canadian embassy, again too hard. They drive up to the Australian embassy, and it looks like an easier target, and they detonate this blast. Was a huge blast. I mean, it shattered windows 300-400 meters away around the city. There debris and glass everywhere. And tragically, 7 people lost their lives. But the embassy itself, nobody inside the embassy building sustained other than minor injuries, because in 1999 the government had fitted ballistic glass. Now, ballistic glass is not designed, it's designed to stop penetrating projectiles like bullets. It's not designed to stop blast waves, so they weren't anchored in, and some of those windows actually fell in or were blown in, and a couple of people were injured as these quite heavy glass windows came in. But ultimately, because of the steps taken in 1999 and that process of protecting against bullets, the embassy was far better protected against blast. And subsequently, we put in blast and ballistic resistant windows around the world, and I was part of that process at the time with the Australian Trade Commission, and we learned a whole lot about enterprise risk and levelling the rock pool, if you like. But this is, for me, the key insight into this is that everything we treat is actually, what you might be for a known event, might be for a white swan, but it's got downstream consequences for a black swan, a green swan, whatever. Things we don't anticipate will always benefit from steps we take now. And sometimes, I just put that thought in your mind as a way of explaining that sometimes it's worth spending a little extra, or it's worth thinking about the possible additional benefits of these risks. Right, moving on. Now, we're getting to Fooled by Randomness. Now, this is the title of a great little book by Nassim Taleb. I think it's his best book. I love Anti-Fragile and Black Swan's an interesting read, but Fooled by Randomness has a whole range of it's essentially a series of chapters with a lot of risk insights. But a couple of them are around how we think we attribute success to our own skill, whereas quite often it's around luck. And when you look at investment managers, so when you put your money into a managed fund, you try to pick one that's been successful and has outperformed. They charge higher fees than putting your money into an index fund. I'm not advocating index funds by any means, by the way. That's a whole other bundle of risk and a whole other conversation. But let's just say, if we think about the index for a stock market, 95% of managed funds fail to beat the index. So they underperform just putting your money into an index. Now, you might look at all the funds you might go to Morningstar or somewhere online to look at the funds and see how many of them are actually outperforming. They go, there's so many here performed so well for 5 years. But what they do is that if a fund doesn't perform well after a period of time, they just close it and open another one. And yes, 5% of fund managers truly do outperform, and there are some stars there. But often, for most of these funds, it's a bit of random luck. If it's like tossing a coin. So it's, this year I'm going to make a position that the market's going to go up, and I'll put my money into, let's say it's New York Stock Exchange is going to go up. Well, this year I think New York Stock Exchange is going to go down, so I'll take the money out, put it into a hedge fund or put options or into bonds. So if you just tossed a coin 10 times in a row and you find someone who calls heads 10 times in a row, and you think this guy, girl, whoever is really talented, they can beat the market every year. But you forget that 1,024 people started tossing coins, and after the first toss, only 512, probably statistically, if you trust the law of large numbers, 512 called it right. The next toss, half of that, 256, then next toss 128, etc., until after 10 tosses or 10 years in the markets, one amazing stock picker has survived, and that's the person you should obviously put your money with. But in reality, they may or may not be a genius. They may be just plain lucky. It's a little bit like the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy analogy, where if you throw an infinite number of monkeys into an infinitely large room with an infinite number of typewriters, ribbons, paper, etc., eventually one of them will produce the entire works of Shakespeare word for word. And in fact, in true fashion, probably the infinite number of them will infinitely produce an infinite number of copies of Shakespeare's work. But this is this idea that anything can happen. We don't necessarily fully understand it when we're looking at performance. Past performance does not predict future performance. And on that key, another really great case study of this is the long-term capital management, where a series of geniuses, Nobel laureates and PhDs took the maths that they'd worked out as part of their Nobel Prize in developing an options theory, the Black-Scholes theorem, and they started a options hedge fund. So they made 40% a year for 5 years, fantastic returns, money was piling in, after right. I mean, everybody wanted to be part of this, and they had all the positions hedged. Nothing could actually trouble them until after year 5, the Russians defaulted on the ruble, and long-term capital management almost brought down the entire financial market. I mean, it was the biggest market failure up until 2008 and up until now 2020. But at the time, literally, these were the smartest guys in the room, and they did very well, but they inevitably made a hash of it because there is some random chance in that. This is about this whole idea of contingency management. So what do we do about it? Well, a little anxiety is a good thing. Being a little anxious is not necessarily a bad thing. Being a lot anxious can be debilitating, but I'll come to ways that we can address that. But firstly, anxiety has an evolutionary benefit. It wouldn't exist if there wasn't some evolutionary edge for it. And the edge is this, that at the back of your mind, you're thinking, did I leave the gas on? Have I fully hedged that exposure? Is that the right project manager to be leading that role? You know, we have this anxiety, and you can't wish away anxiety. The only way to deal with it, you know, and everybody has it to greater or lesser degree, but the key to addressing it is to use it as a tool. Look at what's making you anxious. Go ahead and address it and think, okay, did I leave the iron on? Go and have a look. And put in place something, put a timer on the iron. If you're someone who leaves the iron on and keeps forgetting, you don't want to keep coming up, put a timer on it. You know, put in place something, some sort of contingency which addresses that, and, you know, define this uncertainty and make it your friend. And so that, you know, you'll find a lot of people in business and in life have trouble dealing with ambiguity, and as a risk manager, that's our entire job. That's our ethos. That's what we do, and we have to help people understand and manage that anxiety. So work with that. But this idea, you know, about putting a timer on the iron, it's about having a plan B. And if planning, you know, the notion or the quote goes that basically plan's worthless, planning is fantastic, but for me, a good plan B is priceless. You always want to have a plan B in place before you execute plan A. And I mean, literally at the point where, you know, a pilot in a fighter aircraft and military aircraft wouldn't go into the air without knowing they have an ejector seat and that it's been tested and it's working, because it's too late when things go wrong to think, oh, gee, what do I do now? Let me work out a plan B for getting out of this burning aircraft. And as risk managers, you know, I learned this working in Africa, where for those of you who've been to Africa, or you may have heard of this concept, TIA, this is Africa. Well, there's another, AWA is the other great acronym, which is Africa Wins Again. Things always go wrong, and as it is in Africa, as it is in the rest of the world and life. And so have a plan B which is ready to go, not just a paper plan B or an idea, but ready to go. And so if things do go wrong, if the project falls over, or the event you're organising, a major conference, and something goes wrong, you can be the coolest person there when you simply say, when people are running around with their heads cut off and your boss is worried or your client's panicking, you go, that's not a problem, press this switch, and plan B comes into effect, and you know, you'll win brownie points, but more to the point, you'll have managed the risk effectively by having that plan B in place. Now, finding out what plan B is can sometimes be a little bit challenging, but one of the best tools for that is thinking about our intuition. And intuition is a very notional beast. It's a mixture of the emotional brain and the, you know, gut feelings. There's some really good science behind that, and I'll put a reference to a book by Gerd Gigerenzer, who's done some of the best work on this. His stuff on fast and frugal trees is fabulous, really worth a look for understanding decision making. But the big takeaway, the insight here, is that when we talk about trusting our gut, it's not enough to trust our gut. Trusting your gut is actually a 4-step process, okay? First of all, you need to listen. You need to understand how your gut speaks to you, because your gut will speak to you in a different way or a different voice. Maybe it's an internal dialogue, maybe it's an emotion, maybe it's just an idea that comes to you at 3 a.m. But you just need to get used to making a bit of space in your world to listen, and then you need to know how to recognize it. So that's the second step, is recognizing, out of all the noise, is it just anxiety? Is it just me worrying? Or is this really my gut speaking and saying, the best option is to go with A, the best person for the job is B, you know, I should take this job or I shouldn't. All these things we agonize over, we should probably agonize over, but we can throw into the subconscious, and if we know how to listen, we know how to recognize it, and then we know, the third step is trusting you. It's no use if you know what the message is, if you don't trust it, and then fourth step, act on it. Really obvious stuff, okay? But we've all done it. We've all heard this message and gone, yeah, I think that's right, but I don't trust it enough to act on it. Or we get to it next time we have this message, yeah, I really trust that, but I'm just too busy. I can't do that now. Or maybe I'm trying to second guess. Just act. Just do it. 4 steps, okay? 4 steps to intuition. And you can put that into training, you can put that into wherever you want to, but I think that's the fundamental for any good risk manager to make good decisions and good allocation of resources. We need these 4 steps. Now, along the way, this idea of what do we do about making risk management important, and I think we've heard the expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I would also say that we judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge other people by our behaviour. And the corollary of that is that other people don't judge us by what we intended, by what we meant to do. They judge us by what we actually did. They judge us by our behaviour. So this is really an important thing to think about next time you're judging somebody else. People are also using the same method criteria to look at what, and to a certain extent, your intention is less important than the outcome. But equally, there is another element of this when it comes to what is important and what you want people to take away as important. If risk management is important to you and your organisation, then don't talk about it, because people don't judge. Do talk about it, but don't just talk about it, okay? People don't judge what you think is important or what is important to you by what you say is important. So what you tell them is important is okay, they hear that, but subconsciously that goes in the debris of life, really. It gets carried away. In the concept of what you do carries a little more weight. So what you actually do carries a bit more weight, but the most important thing, if you want to communicate that risk is important, is spend your time managing risk. People know that time is valuable, and they know when you allocate time to something. So if you're working with staff or clients or whoever, and you spend your time with them, that sends the message that they're important. And if you spend your time behind a computer working on email, that sends the message equally that email is important. Maybe more time spent behind the computer says that email is more important than they are. And it's the same with your family. If you want to let your family know that they're important, just spend time with them. That is all it is too. So it's as simple as that. If you want to improve risk performance, there are lots of little strategies. This idea of spending time on risk will change the culture of the people around you that you work with you or report to you. Equally, if you want a simple hack to make risk important and get some time spent on risk, just make risk the first agenda item for every meeting at your organisation. Just make that a blanket. Every agenda item, it's risk. You might want to talk about health and safety or financial risk or whatever it is, or just there might be nothing to talk about, but at least it's there on the agenda as something which gets first prominence at every meeting. But ultimately, culture change drives risk. So, we all know risk behaviours and risk is around culture. So the way that I've seen, there are lots of ways for people to change culture. And I've heard it said it takes 5 years to change culture. You can do it in a weekend workshop, or you need a new leader to change culture. But the surest way that I know, and I've applied many times, is that training changes behaviours change attitude change culture. So if you have some objectives in the organisation, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm hoping that you have some personal objectives and the organisation has some objectives which are fairly well identified. Then you start with the end in mind, and you do a training needs analysis. What do we need to do to get people to this point we want them to be, the organisation to the point? And there's a Kirkpatrick 4 levels of training. I'll mention that, I haven't referenced it, but if you look at the Kirkpatrick 4 levels of training, it's well worth looking at, because that's the 4th level is around true organisational change, and you can link that into training. But training is about giving people, you spend time on training, that says it's important. So you send them away for a day of training, they come back with new skills. With new skills, they have a bigger toolbox to solve problems in the workplace, whether that's negotiating contracts, or whether that's leading their people, or whether it's operating a forklift. But they have those skills, and so they'll use those skills, and those skills change the behaviour. So instead of arguing during a conflict, they have negotiating skills, they use those. They use a different behaviour set. And cognitive dissonance is this beautiful thing which comes into play whenever we take an action. Cognitive dissonance will cause us through, making the short version of this, but it will cause us to believe that this must be the right action, because we can't hold these conflicting ideas in our mind of us doing something, but it's the wrong thing. So when we have certain behaviors, our attitude changes, because our attitude is changed by cognitive dissonance saying to us, this is the right thing. So this becomes our attitude. And then when enough people's attitude changes, culture changes. And then when culture changes, performance changes. When performance changes, outcomes change. And a really simple example of this is safety on construction sites. 20, 30 years ago, or 30 years more, 40 years ago now, when I was working in construction, wearing high-vis vests and helmets and boots was entirely optional. In fact, if you did wear them, people would look at you sideways like, a real man doesn't wear a high-vis vest, crazy. But now you go to any construction site, through training and offering the tools and the skills, people's attitudes have changed to it. And if you walk onto a construction site now without a high-vis vest, without a helmet, people will go and get you one. They'll tell you, don't be an idiot, put this on. This is part of the culture. And this is the same, but it's financial risk management, whatever it is. You've got, rogue traders. Let me, it's a perennial problem. But let me give you an example of how to deal with these sort of cultural elements at a more practical level. So we know human beings take risks, and there's a lot of research that suggests that dopamine receptor D4 has a role to play in this. Now, the research isn't conclusive, so give a grain of salt, but it's certainly suggestive, and there is a lot to support this idea. But the dopamine receptor D4 is designed to, it does what it says, receives dopamine. It's got a receptor for that. But depending on how this gene is manifested with you, with a 7R plus or R minus presentation of it, the simple effect is that some people need more dopamine to feel good, and others are quite happy. I'd see this in Africa, driving down from, we would drive days, four-wheel drive to do a fuel run, and we'd go past villages maybe once a week or once a month, and they'd be sitting there beside the road, happy as Larry, in the dust. They had no colour TVs, they had no vehicles, they didn't have even running water, and yet they were happier than most people I know in Australia. And I could never figure out why until I realised dopamine receptor D4. I'm oversimplifying this, but they truly were happy with less. And there's a whole lot of that. That's a whole conversation and presentation I could go into in much more detail. But the bottom line is that some people need to engage in high-risk sports, in adrenaline sports, to feed that dopamine level, to feel good about themselves, to feel happy, to feel normal. Okay, and you'll see this with extreme athletes quite often. That exercise releases dopamine and it makes people feel good. Now, and this is what happens with people working in heights or financial traders. The old rogue trader problem, where you have a great risk management framework, but somebody's still dumping all these options positions and futures positions into the market without really good control over them, and before you know it, your organization's facing bankruptcy or a major loss. There's no simple solution, but one solution comes back to this DRD4, and dopamine can be released through a number of things, smoking, for example, through drug taking, but in more constructive ways, exercise is a great way to release dopamine, and learning releases dopamine. When you learn something new, dopamine is released in the brain. We feel good. We get a bit of a rush. So if you invest in training, not only are you getting the benefit of spending time with people to say, hey, risk management or whatever the heck it is, maybe driver training if you're running a fleet of vehicles, doesn't matter, whatever is appropriate to your organization, you invest in training, you're investing in them, you're saying they're important. You're also setting the scene to say, this is important because I'm training you in this risk management approach. And you're also giving them the dopamine, which they would otherwise get by hanging off scaffolding with our harness or by putting too many option positions unhedged into the market. So, DRD4's got a lot of benefits there. Another element that you often wonder why people make silly decisions, well, it's because the dinosaurs, the reptiles are still running the world. And I don't mean in a David Icke sense about green lizards running for president and heads of countries and what have you. I can't prove him wrong, but I don't actually personally subscribe to this idea. But what I do subscribe to is in the triune brain model, we've got a reptilian brain, which is the first evolved brain. Hundreds of millions of years ago, dinosaurs evolved fight or flight, feed, fornicate, these basic mechanisms for survival. And then mammals came along 2 or 3 million years ago, and started evolving the mammalian brain, but essentially the emotional brain, where we have feelings, where reptiles like crocodiles don't care for their young, but mammals do. We have an emotional attachment. We make decisions based on emotional reasons. And then the humans came along, Homo sapiens, 200,000-300,000 years ago, and we evolved another layer on top of the brain, the neocortex. And this is the logical brain, where we can deal with big ticket items like climate change and how to fix a problem with a car on an assembly line, this sort of stuff. But ultimately, and here's the problem, well, not the problem, it's a bit of a benefit, that the reptilian brain sits on top of the brainstem. It sits on top of the spinal cord. So whatever you're thinking about in a logical point of view or an emotional point of view, the reptilian brain is actually exerting more immediate control over your actions. And this is part of the challenge for it. And it's a good thing. If a car skids off the road towards you as you're walking on the footpath, you don't want to use the neocortex, the top brain area, to be calculating trajectories and solutions and opportunities and how best to approach this and whether it's going to hit me or not. Your emotional brain is already working out, this is bad, this is a big bad thing coming towards me, big pattern of something I want to deal with. But the brain that can actually respond in milliseconds is the reptilian brain, because it's hooked in right in with a shot of adrenaline. It can have you leaping off that sidewalk out of the way of the car or to safety without doing any calculations. It's almost like this is the mature software. The mammalian brain is 2 or 3 million years old, so it's still in beta. It works most of the time, but it still gives us some wrong answers. And the neocortex at 200,000 or 300,000 years old, well, that's a prototype. That's your leading edge developer stuff, and we are still evolving this. So when you are trying to communicate with people, we need to think about the emotional content and the fear content. Is this a benefit, risk, or benefit? Is it going to make me afraid? Am I going to act out of fear? Am I going to act out of desire? So these kind of things, these are some of the reasons why you see people making strange decisions. Pardon me. Now, we like to believe we have free will, and we like to believe that we consciously make decisions. Most of the research says that we don't, pretty much don't. There's a lot of neuroscience shows that decisions are happening in the brain before we're consciously aware of them. Often our conscious mind is justifying a particular behavior, rationalizing it, and we can see that calculation of expressing and rationalizing it after the unconscious has already expressed it. And now whether the unconscious truly has free will, or whether it's acting from a bundle of learned ideas and learned behaviors, I think we can modify the subconscious through training, through repetition, through our conscious mind, but ultimately our behavior is driven by the subconscious. And there's a lot of study which shows, for example, you can change people's behaviors with advertisements on websites which they haven't even consciously seen. I mean, a great book there called Persuasion is written by Robert Cialdini, who spent years going undercover, if you like, as a secret agent with compliance professionals, as he calls them, with salespeople, learning how to get people to sign on the dotted line, learning the tricks to influence people to buy products that they maybe don't even need. He's also a university professor who spent decades researching this. So really clever guy, but expresses it beautifully. It's an easy read, and this is one of the top, probably the top book I think for Homo sapiens to read. It will change the way you look at the world and yourself. And partly also the practical research means that the environment around us often influences us more than we credit, and perhaps even more than we influence it. So interesting to think about the next time you're in a group or with a friend. In many ways, you are a bundle of programmed, me too, I'm not expressing just you. We're all a bundle of programmed behaviors which respond to certain stimuli. And so the other person, to a certain extent, is actually having a greater influence over our behavior. If you've ever lost your temper and then regretted it, that's an example of how you've expressed a behavior without consciously choosing it. If you've ever bought something that a salesperson has convinced you to buy and then regretted it, and probably you won't, because cognitive dissonance then kicks in and goes, oh, well, I bought it, so it must have been a good thing, I must have needed it. But you know where I'm coming from here. So persuasion gives you an entire toolbox of ways to minimize people's influence on you, the ways for you to be a more effective risk manager, to get the resources you need for your enterprise risk project, to get the connection with people, to get them thinking about risks. And part of this process is that you can't tell people what to think, but you can tell them what to think about. And I'll come to that in more time. But first I want to look at where this is going and the biggest risks that we're facing right now, and the tools as well. And it's three things. In real estate, it's location, location, location. In the 21st century, indeed in the third millennia, it is cyber, cyber, cyber. Cyber is the confluence of all these things. And the numbers you can see on the screen relate to the Internet of Things. And this is 2 to the power of 125, or theoretically 2 to the power of 128 IP addresses, which means something connected to the internet. So your phone, your laptop, all these things, they all have IP addresses, they're all connected, but pretty soon your toaster and your fridge, your oven, your car, maybe the clothes will have a computer chip and it be connected to the internet, light bulbs, doors, elevators, you have a chip implant. Eventually, there'll be a whole generation soon. I remember the first TV coming to my house. Our kids don't remember the first computer coming into the house. They've always had computers. Pretty soon there'll be an entire generation that will not remember never having had a chip implant. We'll have mobile phone technology embedded as a chip, and there's a whole generation coming which won't know life without computers or without chips. And in practical terms, because some of these IP addresses are allocated or reserved for the way the network's managed, there are 42 undecillion things, which basically means that every electronic thing built for the next 10,000 years can be connected to this giant network. And when you start thinking about risk, you can't do that in isolation anymore, because our cars will be driverless, cities will be full of driverless cars, traffic lights are all connected to the network, process control, factories, construction, the stock market, every single thing is connected, and they are affecting each other. So for risk managers, now's the time to find out about cyber. Now's the time to get your head across this. The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed, as to quote the great William Gibson. So where we're going is inevitable. We are going towards a connected world. We're going towards genetics, nanotechnology, robotics, the Internet of Things. Every single thing is becoming connected, and we are becoming connected. We are almost telepathic with our mobile phones now, the ability to communicate over distance at will, to share data. We don't need to carry stuff in heads. We are, to a certain extent, anybody who's got a mobile phone connected to the internet is an enhanced, augmented human already. And I think we'll look back in a couple of hundred years, or hopefully if we get lucky enough to be around, but humanity will look back on COVID-19 in a couple of hundred years as being a significant point in history, an epoch. But in thousands of years' time, humans, or Homo sapien Mark II, Homo Deus, will be looking back on this period, this start of the third millennia, as the era when humanity first started to connect and become a bigger thing, where we went from individuals to part of a much bigger thing, a network of not just intelligent beings, but super intelligent computers, augmented intelligence. And assuming we survive the whole artificial intelligence, and we survive when this Earth is absorbed into the sun as it goes supernova in about 400 or 500 million years, eventually our growth trajectory will be amazing. But right now, when you think about risk, you've got to think about we are in an epoch. We are the start of the third millennia, approaching the most significant era in time. And I'll leave you with a couple of last thoughts. In fact, one last thought. When Daniel Kahneman, who's arguably the leading behavioral psychologist of the 20th century, was asked once, what's the most significant or most important scientific scientific tool that people can use now to affect their life and to improve it? He said quite simply, nothing is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it. Which means that when we think about something, it rises in prominence. Now, that makes sense. So if we're thinking about cooking a meal, that should be more important to us while we're cooking the meal than getting the car serviced or about what we're going to do next. Because, we need to pay attention. Hot stoves, all that sort of stuff, putting the right spices in, we need to give it our attention. But we're programmed as a result of this to think that this is more important. And the same thing happens whenever we think about anything. So, you can't tell people what to think, but you can tell them what to think about. And when you want to get some risk communication happening, you need people to think about it because it becomes more important. It's the old story. I can't tell you to buy me a pink elephant, but if I suggest you try not to think about pink elephants, hey, what happens? You're thinking about a pink elephant. And it's the same thing. So, here's a handy hack for you. If you want to exercise to lose a bit of weight, start thinking more about the benefits of exercise. And exercise will become more important to you. If you want to convince your boss to give you a pay rise, don't go in trying to convince them or argue. By all means have a good argument, and you should have some supporting grounds for it. Otherwise, maybe you're best to leave that topic alone. But rather than say, hey boss, what about a raise? You might want to broach it and say, have you thought about what's the possibility of giving me a raise? Or, I'd like to have a discussion with you next week about giving me a raise, or about some sort of a salary increase or a salary increment. However you express it in your organization, get them thinking about it, and that becomes more important. Now, this has obviously good and bad prospects because you can help people. And Thinking Fast and Slow is a great book by Daniel Kahneman. Equally, Persuasion is very big on this. But part of the problem now is that attention is the new oil. As I say, if you're getting a product for free, it means you are the product. So Facebook gives you Facebook for free because you are the product, and your attention is what they are marketing. They're selling your attention to advertisers. And that's because it's worth something. And the more of your attention they can get, the more they can shape you. What rises what we think about rises in importance. So in 2011, 10 years after the anniversary of 9/11, about 3 weeks before the anniversary, some researchers did a poll in New York, and they said, so what are the most important things of the last century, last 100 years? And about 30% of people cited 9/11, which was understanding. It was only 10 years previously, and still in the middle of the Iraq-Afghanistan wars. And so 30% said 9/11 was one of the most significant events in our recent history. At the week of the anniversary, when the media attention was diverted to all the the events and the ceremonies and awareness of the 10th anniversary of 9/11, the same poll produced 70% citing it as one of the most significant events of recent history. 3 weeks later, after the media attention had died down, people weren't thinking about it as much, they ran the poll again, only 30% again at a normalised level considered 9/11 to be one of the more important events of recent history. So this is the message. What we get out there in the media and what we think about and what ideas we share with our colleagues, with our clients, with our workers in terms of risks or risk strategies or risk analysis, these are the things that people will deem important because it gets their attention. And one of the problems as risk managers, I think we have a whole lot more tools and tricks than most people, and we have a level of responsibility because when you think about what's going on with social media, for example, a lot of people, particularly younger generation, but certainly across society, people's attention is being hijacked by, and I mean no disrespect by this, but people's attention really is being driven by a lot of 25 to 35-year-old, mostly white, mostly male, mostly living in Silicon Valley people who are doing everything they can to secure our attention and the attention of youngsters and elderly alike, people of all ages. And so this is really difficult to deal with the algorithms that are happening there because it's having a real effect on our society. But I throw that in there as part of this risk management approach for you. So that's enough from me. I've highlighted a few ideas there. I've unashamedly made up some of them, like the Stroud Matrix and the training changes behavior, changes attitude, changes culture. But they have worked for me, and so I wanted to share them with you. And here is some evidence. There's a website there. It's juliantalbot.fyi.to/5insights. And if you'd like to communicate with me, please leave some questions or some comments in the conference here. But you can also reach me via email from my website at juliantalbot.com. Anyway, thanks. I've run over time. I hope that was useful, and thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again. Bye. Talbot.com. Bye for now.